Welcome to the 29th meeting of the Health and Sport Committee in 2020. We have received apologies this morning from Alex Cole-Hamilton. I welcome Lee Rennie to this meeting as a substitute. I also welcome Stuart McMillan, MSP, who has joined us for stage one consideration of his members. The first item on our agenda today is two evidence panels on the liability for NHS charges treatment of industrial disease, Scotland Bill at stage one. For our first evidence panel, I welcome to the committee Joe Fitzpatrick, Minister for Public Health, Sport and Wellbeing, who is accompanied by Isabel Hines, Governance and Finance Accountant at the Directorate of Health Finance, and Julie McKinney, Head of Internal Financial Performance in the same Directorate at the Scottish Government. Thank you all for joining us today, and can I invite the Minister to start by making a short opening statement before we move to Minister.
Convener, thank you for the opportunity to give evidence today. The Scottish Government is sympathetic to the intentions of the bill to ensure the costs of treating and caring for individuals affected by an industrial illness are recovered from the party who has compensated those individuals rather than the taxpayer. We're keen to consider any proposals which would allow NHS resources to be used more effectively. In saying this, we'd be interested to see more evidence behind the detail of the bill, as there are a number of points which we think require further clarity. The policy memorandum notes that there would be in the region of 500 cases per year, but ultimately states it's impossible to estimate what the costs are to the NHS for treating these people. We'd be keen to see further information about the number of cases and resulting costs. As set out in the memorandum that was submitted to the committee in September, it would also be helpful to have evidence on the anticipated level of revenue that this bill could recover and what the costs of administering the scheme would be. It would be important that the scheme would not run at a loss due to potentially low numbers of cases. At present, the effect of the bill would be for the Scottish ministers to administer the scheme. We know that the member stated in his documents that his preference is for the UK Government to administer the scheme through the Department for Work and Pensions Cost Recovery Unit, and it would be important to clarify details on scheme administration. The bill may need to be amended so that the scheme can be administered by a new statutory body, or new statutory functions need to be given to the existing body. As this unprecedented time, we recognise the difficulty for gathering further evidence around costs to include in the financial memorandum. Nonetheless, in order to come to a clearer position on the bill, we'd require further work to be done on the expected costs that would be recouped comparative to the time and resources that would need to be spent on it. So look forward to the committee's report, and obviously we're happy to take questions this morning.
Thank you very much, Minister. And can I start simply by bearing in mind everything you've just said? Would it be fair to say that you are not averse to the general principles of this bill? You are in fact sympathetic to the general principles of this bill, but in order to proceed to the next stage, you need the questions addressed that you've summarised.
I think that's a very accurate summation of our position. Obviously, I think everyone has an interest in the NHS having additional resource, but we do need to make sure that any scheme we bring in place does that effectively and doesn't end up being more of a drain on resource rather than its intended purpose.
And is it, in that case, is it your view that the issues you've raised, the practical and implementation issues which you've raised, are all ones which can be addressed within the scope that Parliament has for taking this legislation to conclusions?
I think there is more information that we would need around that in terms of the intentions. I think we are clear that there looks like there's more work that is required to be done. Clearly, the government would be keen to help the committee in those endeavours to get more information if that's the decision is that this should go forward in this Parliament. Obviously, with the current pandemic, accessing some of that data is particularly difficult just now, and more difficult than it would be in normal times, particularly issues around finances.
Thank you very much. That's helpful. And can I now call on Emma Harper?
Convener, good morning, Minister. You've raised the issues of finance as part of maybe one of the challenges is finding out about the cost of what this scheme would be. I'm interested in some issues around the definition of industrial disease. The bill defines industrial disease as a disease arising out of employment of the injured person or arising out of employment of any person associated with the injured person. And it makes the person suffering from the disease eligible for employment injury assistance under the regulations made by the Scottish Ministers. So I'm interested, Minister, as whether you think that there might be any issues with the implementation of the new scheme arising from definitions of industrial disease, and if so, what are the reasons for potentially implementing this new scheme if there's any challenges with the definitions?
Minister.
As the bill goes through the parliamentary process, it is really important that we make sure we get definitions which are robust. Clearly, the scheme that exists just now is a UK-wide scheme, and this would be a divergence from that. And in these aspects, that would be Scotland specifically, and so that there would be a balance there in terms of how we make sure that the aspects of the scheme which remain aligned across the 4 nations would still be robust, while making sure we have appropriate definitions for the specifics of this scheme.
Thank you very much. We can move on to question number, the next question, unless Emma has a supplementary question. We'll move on and call David Stewart.
I'd like to talk about the administration of the scheme. Who should administer the new scheme? Should it be the Scottish Government or the Compensation Recovery Unit at the DWP?
Minister.
That is, of course, a very important question. Obviously, the member has suggested he thinks it should be the Cost Recovery Unit at the DWP, and my officials have contacted the DWP to seek clarification on their position, and we are still awaiting a response to that. Obviously, we would provide that information to the committee when it is received. It is a very important question because that would determine to some extent where the burden of those costs would rest. Clearly, if the cost was resting on the NHS and those costs were higher than the costs recovered, then we have a scheme which, while in principle is intended to help the NHS, does exactly the opposite. And so it would be really important as the Parliament and the committee looks at this, that we make sure that we haven't inadvertently created a scheme which does exactly the opposite of what Mr McMillan and I'm sure others would hope it would do.
If I could come back and convener, my question here is my own experience just looking at the 4 nations is that governments tend to underestimate the costs of providing new services. As a generalisation, there's hidden costs in setting any new organisation up. The advantage about the Compensation Recovery Unit is it's an existing scheme. It knows which way is up. This is not a party political issue. I can understand the Minister may wish to have a lot more powers to the Scottish Parliament. This is not what we're talking about. This is about ensuring that it's cost effective. And what we're not doing is creating another huge tier of bureaucracy.
Yeah. So I'm sorry if I gave the impression that I had a preference one way or the other. I don't. What I'm stating is that the bill as drafted rests those powers with Scottish ministers, while I understand Mr Stewart and Mr McMillan have a preference that it would be administered by the Cost Recovery Unit, but the bill as drafted would rest those powers with Scottish ministers.
Okay, thank you.
Sandra White. Thank you. Sandra White.
Can I ask, I know that you've said in your opening remarks you're sympathetic to the scheme, and there's a number of issues about more evidence needing and finance also. And just following on from Dave Stewart's question, I just wanted to ask, has the Scottish Government, or what consideration the Scottish Government has given to the potential costs of administrating this new scheme And I note that the DWP charged £215,000 to administer the scheme on obviously our behalf. So I just wonder if you could elaborate on that. Have you looked seriously at whether you would continue with this scheme? Obviously having to set up a unit with Scottish ministers, or even a Scottish-only scheme as well.
So the member is absolutely right in terms of the cost that DWP charges, and that £215,600. So that is a figure which is there. Obviously, this isn't a bill that the Scottish Government is taking forward. If the committee decides that it should move to the next stage, then clearly we would do as much work as is required around that. Obviously, just now with COVID, a huge amount of resources are being used towards the COVID response. As I said in my opening, I think some of these costings might be more difficult to estimate under current circumstances than they might be in normal times.
Thank you. Could I have a small follow-up, convener?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for the correspondence that we received from the Scottish Government. And I note in one of the points about the Scottish Government's position, I think it's point 10, that basically if the Scottish Government wished to set up their own scheme, you would need to speak to the DWP and basically whether you would have the capacity to provide this service and whether the DWP would be quite happy to work with you to set up a separate service. How difficult would that be, Minister?
Well, as I said, Scottish Government officials have contacted DWP to seek clarification on their position, and we have not yet had a response. I guess that they are suffering the extra pressures that we are suffering and the committee is suffering in terms of the work that they're doing around the COVID response as well. But we will make sure the committee gets the response.
Okay, thank you very much.
Very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Can I now call on Brian Whittle?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the Minister. You kind of alluded to this in your opening statement, Minister, and also in written evidence. The Scottish Government did comment that further explanation is needed as to whether the costs of setting up the scheme are worthwhile to ensure incur costs. I just wonder if the Scottish Government have made any assessment of the potential financial benefit to the NHS of the scheme as set out in the bill.
Minister.
As I say, this is not our bill, and we'll take it forward as the committee suggests. I think my point from my opening is that there is, I think, some additional evidence that would be required for that assessment to be able to be made, and I think that there's two sides to that. One, the costs of administration, and two, what might be recovered. Both these things are difficult to estimate in any time, and the Parliament and Government are used to making estimates where it is difficult to access that information. But I think the point I would make that it is especially difficult just now, given the pressures that we're all facing.
Okay, quickly, thank you. Just to understand what process will be required going forward to get the information you required, and sort of a timescale on that.
Minister.
Well, so I mean, I guess my point would be this is not a Scottish Government bill, so I think the member and the committee would need to satisfy themselves that they have got figures which are robust. Clearly, if there's a role for the Scottish Government within that, then we will put the resource which is required. Clearly, that resource will have to come from someplace. The Health Directorate in particular is working very hard across the board. We've already had to put aside a number of government's priorities in health and elsewhere in order to focus on the work which is required to respond to the virus.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. William Rennie.
I'm not detecting a great deal of enthusiasm from the Minister, but perhaps he can maybe tell us about whether he's looked at the University of Stirling's work on this, the Occupational and Environmental Health Research Group, who said that the money that can come in from this could easily cover their own costs. Has he looked at that, and does he agree with the assessment?
Minister.
So I haven't specifically looked at the University of Stirling. I don't know if Isabel wants to say anything, is able to say anything on that.
Isabel Hines.
Thank you for having me today here. I haven't specifically seen this piece of work, but I can certainly have a look at it and submit any views to the committee should that be required.
Okay, thank you for that. William Rennie.
No, that's fine. I'll pass. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I now invite Stuart McMillan, who is the sponsor of this bill, to ask any questions he may have for the Minister, and can I ask other members of the committee who may want to ask questions of the Minister to indicate with an R in the chat box just now, and I'll try and bring you in after. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, the question was posed earlier regarding the definition of industrial diseases. Do you believe that the definition in the bill is robust? I know that the issue of robust or not was touched upon by my colleagues.
Minister.
In terms of, as it is, the definition doesn't give us a huge concern, so that there's nothing in there that clearly, if it was going to the next stage, we would look to see if there needed to be any amendments to that. Unless Isabel has anything counter to say, that's not one of the areas we would have a huge concern about. But Isabel, have you got any further? Isabel,
so I would agree. I'd agree with that assessment. Yep, there's nothing, and it would be at stage 2 that we would be looking to make further assessments, but nothing right now.
Stuart McMillan.
Okay, thank you. And on the issue of the financial memorandum, one of I think it was Willie Rennie just posed the question regarding Stirling, and yourself hadn't seen the information from the University of Stirling. But certainly the University of Stirling had indicated in their evidence last week that they believed that the bill would be, it would cover the costs if this was introduced. It would cover the costs, and additional resource would go into NHS. So with that, Minister, could I ask you to also, once today is over, and I'm very much aware also that you're waiting for the reply to come in from the DWP, recommend that you have a look at that particular evidence from the University of
Minister.
Well, yeah, of course, we'll all have a look at the evidence. I think it's important, though, that the financial memorandum for the bill is as robust as possible, and if there's more data that can go into those estimates, then from the University of Stirling, then I think that would be important. So, as I say, I haven't seen what they've said, so I don't know what assumptions they've made on who's administering the scheme, what the costs of administering the scheme would be, and how many cases they have assessed. So it sounds like it's an interesting piece of work. You're saying it was presented last week, so neither I or my officials have seen it as yet. But I guess that would be important, that information, if it is, as you say, would be looked at.
Okay, thank you very much. Stuart McMillan, please. Yes, do come back.
Thank you. Just one final question, if I may, Convener, and that's just it's on the administration of this proposal, and I'm sure this will come to this as well, and when I'm asked questions very shortly. But the suggestion for the CRU to undertake the administration was one to ensure that costs would be reduced as compared to establishing something new in Scotland, and with that particular consideration, does the Minister think that certainly even in the short to medium term, that would actually be the most appropriate way forward to ensure that a bill could be introduced, or this particular proposal could be introduced, until such times as any constitutional arrangements are altered and changed.
Minister.
I think it's really important that we understand who would administer such a scheme, whether in the short term and in the longer term. And as I said, my officials have contacted the DWP to assess their take on this, but we haven't yet had that response. So I don't know if there's an opportunity for DWP-CRU to carry out this work, or if they might just say no. We just don't have that information. My officials will chase the DWP for a response in relation to administration, and if that comes in, we'll make sure the committee gets sight of that.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. And there being no further questions for the Minister and his officials, can I thank them for their attendance today? Can I ask that the further evidence which the Minister has offered to provide the committee is with us by the 20th of November at the latest? That will allow us to proceed with the schedule we have set.
If we have it, as I say, it's ours.
Indeed, but in as far as that's possible, that would be welcome, and would assist the committee with its work. Thank you very much. We now move on to the second evidence panel in relation to this bill, and I welcome back poacher turned gamekeeper, or gamekeeper turned poacher, I'm not sure which, Stuart McMillan, who is the member in charge of the liability for NHS Scotland Bill, who is accompanied as a witness by Andrew Milne, the head of the Non-Government Bills Unit of the Scottish Parliament, Kenny Keane, a solicitor, and Sinead Knox, researcher for Stuart McMillan. Can I welcome all of the above to the evidence session today, and can I ask Stuart McMillan, who will no doubt be considering the evidence he's just heard and indeed enlisted, but if he would like to make a short opening statement before we move to questions. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you very much, Convener, and certainly at the outset I would like to thank a few people and organisations for their assistance in helping to get the bill to this point. Firstly, Phyllis Craig, MBE of Action on Asbestos, formerly Clydeside Action on Asbestos, and also Laura Blaine of Thomson Solicitors. Phyllis and Laura have been the genesis of the bill, and they've been consulted at every part of the process. This the second attempt of trying to bring this type of legislation into Parliament, and I believe that this bill is more tightly drawn and focused than my proposal in the last session. Staff at the NGBU here in Parliament have worked tremendously hard to get the bill into shape and also to be introduced in Parliament also, and I'd like to offer my thanks to them. And finally, to my former staff members, Sean Kavanagh and Jennifer Johnston, as well as my present staff member, Shona Knox, who have all played a part in helping shape the bill in front of the committee this morning. The bill's purpose is to help bring additional financial resource into NHS Scotland whenever there is a successful personal injury claim in relation to industrial injuries. Claimant not need to do anything extra, but this additional sum to the NHS would be consequential on a successful claim for damages. The liability to repay NHS costs fall upon the responsible organisation, that is the organisation already required to pay the damages. This may be an employer or their insurance company. The bill is not retrospective, therefore it would only cover harmful events that occur after the bill has come into force. And I believe that the bill will deliver two main things. Firstly, after a period of time, it will introduce additional finances into NHS Scotland. And secondly, it will encourage employers to introduce better health and safety measures. And as a result of this, I believe and I would expect a long-term reduction in insurance premiums. It certainly would be unavoidable that premiums would rise short-term, but particularly as soon as the Act would come into force, employers liable for a new category of cost, and sensible employers will want to actually extend their insurance to cover that risk. Certainly in the longer term, costs would reduce. And finally, in terms of administering the system, to be in place by the bill. I would prefer that this would be done by the CRU, as already touched upon, and it does already exist, and asking it to take on a new task would be easier and also cheaper as compared to establishing something new. But I still think that the bill would be worthwhile if a Scottish equivalent of the CRU had to be established to administer it. And I'm quite sure I'm going to get some questions about the financial memorandum as touched upon this morning, so I'll happily take questions, and thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you very much. And can I start by asking you, you clearly we're talking about future events, as you've just said very clearly, but nonetheless, on the basis of past events, you will have some estimate or some idea in mind of how many cases may end up being covered by this bill in a way that they're not currently covered. I wonder if you could indicate what number of cases you think might be involved on an annual basis.
Well, certainly, Convener. One of the challenges of attempting to bring the bill forward was certainly on the financial memorandum. That's been touched upon. It has been difficult trying to get figures for cases to go forward. However, also the financial memorandum and the bill, we used a figure of 514 cases. That's information that's based upon the information provided by Thomson's solicitors. I'm also aware of the additional information that was presented to the committee by the FSCM and Alan Rogerson, had sent in some additional information. But also, I believe that I think that the 514 would be a rough estimate, but nonetheless, as time goes forward, with industrial diseases that we don't yet know what they are, then that figure clearly will differ.
Indeed, but that's a helpful starting place. Can I now call on Emma Harper?
Thank you again, Convener, and good morning to Stuart McMillan. You talked a little bit about other industrial diseases, and I am interested in the definition of industrial diseases. Last week, we heard evidence that the term industrial disease might be a bit out of date, and that maybe we should be using the words disease or long-term injury from employment. And I'm interested in the emergence of industrial diseases or injuries or illness caused by COVID, or mental health has been also mentioned. Thomson solicitors reminded the committee last week that liability would have had to have already been established for a person to become liable for NHS charges. But the issue of mental health conditions and emerging conditions such as COVID and long COVID might be an issue to consider. And obviously these are new issues, and I'm just wondering if Stuart McMillan considers that these might be covered in the provisions in the bill.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you. I think certainly that's a valid question, and certainly yes, my answer to it. I think when you consider obviously some of the information that's in the policy memorandum and also the financial memorandum, the issue of industrial disease is defined quite broadly to include any diseases arising out of a person's employment, but also a disease arising out of another person's employment, so long as that causal connection between the disease and the employment. The definition also does include diseases that confer eligibility for employment injury assistance, as defined by the regulations, the Social Security Scotland Act 2018 regulations. But I think that your point regarding COVID, I think is certainly it's worth considering, and I would do that. But I think ultimately, I think yes would be the short answer to your question.
Emma Harper, you.
Thanks. It's just a quick follow-up. And obviously the work that you have done to prepare this and get this far has been, fantastic and very detailed. And I am just interested in the fact that now we have a COVID pandemic that might have added just additional complexity when considering, I suppose, financial implications going forward.
Yes, I mean, I think that's certainly a fair assessment. Also, when the bill was being produced and worked on, so COVID wasn't here. COVID wasn't on the horizon. So it's certainly things are somewhat different now compared to at that time. But I'm happy to bring Andrew Milne in, if it's okay, Convener.
Andrew Milne.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, it was just to add to what Mr McMillan had said, that the way the bill works in terms of how it sets up the definition of industrial disease, it's important to bear in mind that this only applies in a case where there's already a compensator. In other words, where an employer usually has accepted liability in the first place for what would become a damages claim, and the NHS cost recovery flows from that. So in a case, for example, where someone contracts COVID, it have to be the case that the employer was liable and therefore would have to pay damages for the circumstances in which that employee contracted COVID. So it certainly wouldn't apply automatically just because someone contracts COVID while they're at work. There would have to be that extra element. But subject to that, the definition is drawn fairly broadly. But obviously, there would be capacity to adjust that according to the policy that was in the government wished to impose on it in the future. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. Emma, are you happy with those answers?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. In that case, I will now call Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Convener. Stuart, I wonder if whether you're able to provide more information to us on estimates of the amounts the new scheme is anticipated to recover. And I asked that question in the context of supplementary evidence that Alan Rogerson's provided the committee, where he estimates that over 12 years there'd be approximately £500,000 shortfall between the cost of administering the scheme on the one hand and the estimated amounts recovered.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Donald. I saw that information, and I must admit, certainly with any type of damages legislation, and this isn't that, of course, I am very much aware of the scepticism of the insurance industry when it comes to supporting any type of legislation going forward, and that certainly was the case in the 2009 Pluralplax legislation also. So I saw the figures, and I can see why they have suggested those. I'd also like to point to information from the Compensation Recovery Unit data. They suggested that £66.8 million was recovered from employers, and that was for 90,219 settlements. So using this particular data, £740 ATP was recovered on average per case, and if this figure was actually applied to the estimated 514 industrial disease cases, that can actually generate over £380,000 for NHS Scotland. So I think this clearly the situation regarding the financial memorandum has been difficult to really nail down in terms of getting the absolute accurate information, and I think this is where the Minister's comments in the earlier session were helpful to try to get, well, if the committee decide to move the bill forward, to try to get some assistance to really have potentially more accurate data, but at the same time I would suggest that it's impossible to determine how many cases will come forward. But then that's just the nature of this particular proposal.
Donald Cameron.
I entirely agree with that last comment. It's very difficult to predict. My only other question is to ask about the current cap, which for 2020 I think is at 54,566. And I just wondered if, Stuart, you had any view about that, reflecting on it, whether it should be increased or even removed.
I'm quite flexible on whether the cap should remain as is or be amended. I don't really have a fixed position on that, and I'd be quite keen to just kind of find out a bit more from the committee as to what they would suggest.
Thank you very much. And can I now call David Tollins?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Stuart McMillan. Evidence from the Forum of Scottish Claims Managers, the Association of Personal Injury Lawyers Scotland and Thomson Solicitors Scotland believe that the Compensation Recovery Unit would be the best place to administrate the new scheme. What discussions have you had with the Compensation Recovery Unit on the possibility of undertaking the administration of the new scheme, and what is their view?
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. I previously did write to the DWP in October 2018, and I did get a reply back from them. And they indicated that they previously had been approached by the Welsh Government for the CRU to administer its proposed legislation to enable the recovery of NHS costs relating to industrial diseases. And they explained that they were willing to discuss the proposals in order to understand the feasibility of the request. The Scottish Government also approached the DWP and also appropriate DWP officials to discuss any proposal to use the DWP CRU with the Scottish Government representative. They didn't say they wouldn't do it, but just they would have that dialogue to decide as to whether it would or wouldn't happen.
Yeah. David Tollins, do you want to come back?
No further questions, Convener.
That's great. Thank you very much. Now move on and call George Adam.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Stuart. I can obviously see the challenges you face when you've been trying to get this worthy bill together, but the whole point of the bill is to ensure, Stuart, that the claimants have a positive outcome. And there's been a number of issues brought up with regards to appeals and reviews and how it would take longer and clog up the system effectively. Like BML commented that their quote would be, in our view, the complexities of these cases are likely to mean that the administrative burden placed on NHS boards is greater than that which they are presently accustomed to. Now, one of the things that would worry me, and I would just like to ask the question, is this: whether it's anticipated that there will be increased proportion of appeals and reviews under the new scheme for industrial disease claims compared to the existing scheme.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, George. Clearly, obviously, appeals, the appeals process already exists, but as per the Section 12 of my policy memorandum, compensators must also make the payments required by the certificate before appealing against it, unless this requirement is raised by ministers. But a decision by ministers not to waive this requirement may also be appealed to the first tier tribunal. So in effect, also appeals could still happen, but the payment has to happen first before any appeal.
But sure, would there be an increase, or would there be more? There would likely be more claims, and therefore it would be more difficult within the system, would it not?
That's hard to determine as to whether there would or would not be more claims. I know we heard in the evidence last week that was suggested that that would actually be the case. But generally hard to determine as to whether there would or wouldn't be more or less appeals. But certainly, but I think that the key point to this is that the compensators must make the payments before appealing.
Okay.
Rosa.
So would you say this the complexity and the difficulty and the whole process, have you taken this, has this been taken into account when assessing the cost and complexity of administrating, if I could say it, the scheme? Because that would be a concern as well.
Yes, certainly I accept there is a complexity to this, but at the same time also the proposal is to use the CRU process, try to make it easier as compared to setting up something new. So, but also accept that it's certainly due to some of the complexities in terms of trying to calculate the cost of the NHS treatment for each individual personal injury claim. The CRU operates a tariff system and with a cap that sets the maximum amount that will be claimed from any compensator. So although there are complexities, there is already a process in place to make this proposal a bit easier to actually progress and also to be delivered.
And finally, Stuart, just to get it right in my own head, at this stage, none of us have heard anything from the CRU, though, have we?
No. Obviously, the DWP are the UK government agency that operates the CRU, and certainly in their reply back to me, from DWP that is, they didn't say no, they wouldn't do it, but they would have to have the dialogue with the Scottish Government, then come to an agreement as to whether they would or wouldn't undertake this particular piece of legislation.
Thank you very much. Can I now call Brian Whittle?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr. McMillan. I raised this actually last week around the implementation of health and safety between the differences between having an SME and a major multinational company, and how it can be more difficult for an SME to. So can I ask initially what any considerations have been given to how the changes to liability resulting from the bill would be publicised?
Certainly, not specifically so far, but there are a few things I would imagine that certainly would need to happen. First of all, a media campaign, also by the Scottish Government. But secondly, I would suggest that organisations such as the FSB Scotland, the Scottish Chamber of Commerce, as well as trade associations, help get the information and publicise change to the business community, particularly the small business community, would be extremely useful. And I'm sure that all the organisations that I've mentioned, that they will have been informed, they will have been involved in publicity campaigns in the past for a wide variety of issues, so I wouldn't see any issue there.
Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Mr. McMillan. So just as a final question around that, just to clarify, who you think would be responsible for getting that information out to SMEs of the changes in that relation to the liability for NHS charges? As I said before, I think there's, especially the smaller SMEs, it can be a little bit more difficult to implement this kind of legislation at that level. So who would be responsible for informing them?
Ultimately, the Scottish Government would be the main body to get information out, to share that information and pass the correct information over. But also in the industry bodies would play a pivotal role in doing this. But I don't see it as just being one organisation to undertake that particular task. I accept the point that Brian Whittle is making, particularly regarding some of the smaller businesses and micro businesses. But at the same time, I think with many aspects of public policy and policy changes, it tends not to just be one organisation, usually the Scottish Government, who would tend to put information out into the public domain. They might be the lead organisation. At the same time, other relevant organisations would play their part to help get that information out.
Thank you.
Brian Whittle, you okay?
I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I therefore call Willie Rennie.
Yeah, I think Stuart McMillan's answered this question already, but let me just, for absolute clarity, does he believe there will be any delays in the compensation payments from people with industrial diseases as a result of this bill? I understand the point he's saying that they have to pay before they appeal, but is there any knock-on consequences for the rest of the process with added complexity?
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you. Yeah, you're right, Mr. Rennie, in terms of, I have touched upon this earlier, but I generally don't see how the bill would lead to compensators delaying making any payments in industrial disease cases any more than the delayed compensation payments in accidental injuries cases at the moment. So I generally don't see any reduction in the outcome that we're looking to see, also delivered with this particular bill.
Could I have a follow-up, convener?
Yes, please. Please do.
Yeah, it's just following on a comment earlier regarding liaison with the DWP. I mean, has there been any political engagement at all? Have you spoken to the Work and Pensions Secretary about whether they would be politically supportive of them collecting the payments?
Stuart McMillan.
I haven't spoken to them. I did write to them, and I got the reply in saying that I think, as I touched upon earlier, they gave the example of the Welsh Government discussion, that they would want to have that dialogue with the Scottish Government. So I did write to them, but I haven't spoken, but I did write to them.
Okay, thank you very much. And can I call David Stewart?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to Stuart McMillan. I'm generally very supportive of this bill, but in my experience dealing with bills in the past, there's always issues around unintended consequences. So my specific question is this: have you carried out an analysis, or any analysis, on the potential impact of this bill on future insurance premiums for Scottish businesses compared to the rest of the UK?
Stuart McMillan.
We looked at this, and I think certainly it's fair to assess, and I did touch upon this in the opening comments, that insurance premiums inevitably in the short term would increase, and or certainly additional insurance cover would be sought as a result of this bill. But over time, as employers take further precautions, protect their staff, then the premiums should actually come down. And I think, and I also genuinely believe also that over a period of time, Scotland could then actually become the safest part of the UK in terms of employment. Because if this particular piece of legislation were to go forward, I think, as we heard last week, there would be health and safety benefits for this bill to progress.
And through you, Convener, saying on this issue, do you have any specific evidence about when these costs will change? Because clearly, no one in the committee wants to see higher costs in Scotland for our businesses to make business in Scotland being uncompetitive compared to the rest of the UK.
Stuart McMillan.
I accept the point that Mr. Stewart raises, but I would go back to my comments a few moments ago. So there is the issue certainly of being competitive, but also the aspect of actually being the safest place to go to work. And I genuinely believe that in the short term, as I have indicated before, that the premiums no doubt would increase, and I'm not going to run away from that. I have to be upfront with that. But at the same time, if the bill were to progress, and it was seen that Scotland actually was a safe place to work, then it's quite. I would suggest it's quite the next step would be for premiums to actually reduce, premiums to come down, for businesses who actually are doing the right thing, who are working to protect their employees, and that could also have a beneficial effect on the output from the employees, because they feel safe, they know they're going to go to work and they're going to go home. So in the short term, insurance costs would be higher, which is what I would expect. Certainly medium to longer term, costs would reduce, because Scotland would also become the safest part of the UK to work.
David Stewart.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. My final question, and Mr McMillan may have touched on this already, but just for the record, do you consider that the bill would have a preventative impact and result in fewer industrial disease claims in the future?
Stuart McMillan.
Yes, I do. But I will caveat that with I think a comment I made a few moments ago also, that we don't know what new industrial diseases will come forward at some point in the future. So I think so my answer is yes to what we already know with the list of industrial diseases that are already there. But certainly with new cases, my answer is I don't know, because we don't know what new industrial diseases.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, and can I thank Stuart McMillan and other witnesses for their attendance this morning. That's been a thorough examination of the issues around the bill, and we will proceed to have a further discussion in the committee in due course. Thank you for now, and we'll now move on. Now, the agenda item 2 relates to the Forensic Medical Services Bill at stage 2, but clearly involves a number of people besides members of the committee. So what I propose to do now, as we won't be able to proceed to stage 2 of the Forensic Medical Services Bill until 10:45, so what I would propose to do now is to suspend briefly and to resume on a different platform just before 10 o'clock, which will allow us to deal with agenda items 3 and 4 in advance of agenda item 2, simply to accommodate those participants in stage 2 who are not with us at the moment. If members can follow the advice of our broadcasting team to remember that Blue Jeans remains live, but we will send out a request for a separate meeting on Teams in a few moments. We will have that opportunity to deal with some of our other agenda items ahead of the session around the Forensic Medical Services Bill. So on that basis, colleagues, I now suspend this meeting.